Hello and welcome to Tapas and Pretzels. I think this should be like the fifth podcast. And welcome, Tim and David. And I talked last week about spaghetti eyes. And you talked about spaghetti code. And maybe, Tim, you can tell me what do you mean with the spaghetti code and how to avoid the spaghetti in the API world. That's Tim and David.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Inge. And
Sorry, Inga.
you
You repeat.
No problem.
it's David. I like the highlighting because we had a long discussion when we started the podcast. What should be the name of the podcast? And we initially thought of like putting Tim and the David Show as the name of the podcast show, but in the end, like we didn't want to be too selfish and just gave our names as the headlines. If you want to change that, please let us know, audience. But I think we tried to came up with something more creative, and Tapas and Pretzels is actually originated about like we had a discussion about great food, and then we came up with the idea of okay, why don't we name the podcast Tapas and Pretzels?
Yeah.
But Binga, back to your question, API and spaghetti code. By the way, spaghetti eyes is also a German dish, which is probably not known all over the world. But it's
Yeah.
basically ice cream, which looks like a spaghetti. Carbonara, no, it's carbonara, like normal Napoleano, the spaghetti with tomato sauce, but made out of ice cream, which is really delicious. If you go to Germany, like really try it. It's one of the most common dishes in every uh, Thanks for explanation. So I'm the pretzels part. Sometimes during the summertime, I don't look like a pretzel, but I'm the pretzel part. And and so back to the topic. So API spaghettis. Yeah, we have spaghetti code on the software engineering side that actually means your source code is too unstructured and it's not kind of clear what is the route you're following through the source code, and it's really hard to understand. And you cannot probably not going to reuse exposed functionality or methods in your source code. And the same is also true for APIs. The aim we are following to build an API program is basically we all have in mind to build these awesome tool belt where you can have the API and you can really easily collect these APIs and build new products that can really expose to the markets within hours or minutes or days. I mean, super fast in the end. The problem with that and how it's going to end up in spaghetti is actually if you consider a life cycle and you're not really closely monitoring who's using the API for what. So let's assume you have built an API and some people are using it for building internal products, exposing it to the customers, and also then like take that API and mix it with another API to another product, and that will be exposed to the client. And now the API lifecycle hits because you have to improve the API because of new requirements or so on. And then you do want to change that API. And then you again are tied back into a huge dependency chain because it's not easy sometimes to change that API because you might have break changes and so on. And then you're slowing down the whole thing. And it's probably not really completely structured, the API, because the bounded context has changed and so on. And I think it's a common problem if you not have a clear definition of your API layer, so to say, where to use what and under which circumstances. So it's a typical problem that you're going to run into. And so before I'm going to talking all the time, David, how about what is your aim or your solution on API spaghetti?
Yeah, I think that, of course, having a messy set of APIs, it's a problem. So a good effort in make an assist, I would say, assessment of your APIs is key for an API strategy to succeed, because not all the APIs have the same requirements in regarding to the life cycle of APIs. This takes you to different requirements in the governance, in managing each of the stages of the API lifecycle. So that's why defining a well-known and a solid API governance framework is key in any organization, because it allows you to identify the groups of APIs, the API products, the products API, APIs for integration, internal APIs, partners APIs, private APIs. No matter which criteria you use to classify or to define that API taxonomy, but use one. It's your criteria, so use, but use it consistently across the organization, and then define API governance policies for each of the groups or taxonomy you already identify. Because it's not the same an API used mainly for integration. Of course, that API should be managed, because you have to deal with versions. What happens if the backend service changes a parameter or a new method? How are you going to translate that those modifications to your APIs? What will happen if you change the API? What will happen with the apps or the applications that are already consuming that API? Probably they will break or not, depending on how you define those governance policies. It's also it's not also the same situation for an API that is your product API. You are define, or your API product. You are selling your APIs to build to help others to build a digital ecosystem. So this requires from your side having that well-defined framework, API governance framework we mentioned before.
Absolutely. And one thing is, I think probably most companies do it in this way. Like for internal APIs, they're probably not putting that much effort into advanced documentations for an API, because it's like, internally who the people are, you can get in contact with them. And the documentation is probably not as good as it should be. I mean, they should treat every API as it should be a public API, but let's be honest, there are some APIs which are documented way better than others. And I think if you have some internal guidelines, if you have some requirements, what is probably an internal API, what is a partner API, what is an external API, and probably you want to have a pretty good state-of-the-art documentation to your external API. Also, then the API program should be like handling or differentiate between those levels of API, the taxonomy that David was referring to. Another like crucial aspect, if you consider an API as one of the revenue streams of a company, because you want to have a pretty good documentation so that people can use your API and you can generate the revenue you're expecting from it.
Yeah, one thing that is working very, very well in some of our customers is API rating or API certifying, which is you set different types of APIs, different classes, and or levels of certification, and in the higher level, which is the best quality APIs, you make having the documentation up to date mandatory, so that if your API won't be in production unless your documentation will be enough good, to do that.
So documentation is a good word, especially also in the software development. Comments and documentation is really mandatory. And to the Spaghetti APIs. Thank you for the explanation, Tim, what it's meant in the API world. And David, also thank you very much about the explanation how we can solve it. And so therefore, just go outside, eat your spaghetti ice cream, or at least try it. And then have a good day, and I think we will see us later or the next time.
Okay, thank you very much. You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.